Imagine standing on a riverbank nearly 4,000 years ago. The water that has fed your fields, filled your wells, and carried your boats to distant cities for as long as anyone can remember is shrinking, year by year, season by season, until one day you realize the river your grandparents swam in is barely a trickle of mud. You don't know it yet, but you are watching the slow death of one of the most advanced civilizations the ancient world had ever produced. No invading army is marching toward your city. No king has declared war. There are no burning temples, no toppled statues, no dramatic battle to mark the end. And that, my friends, is exactly what makes this story so unsettling. Because sometimes the most powerful civilizations in history don't fall to swords or fire. Sometimes they simply run out of water. So let me ask you something before we go any further. What would it take to destroy a civilization with cities more advanced, in some ways, than ancient Rome? A civilization with planned streets, underground sewage systems, and standardized weights used across an area larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined. If you guessed war, conquest, or a tyrant king, you'd be wrong. The truth is stranger, quieter, and honestly, a lot more relevant to us today than you might expect. Stick with me, because by the end of this, you might start looking at your own city's water supply a little differently. We're going to travel today across two great river civilizations, separated by hundreds of kilometers and at least a century or two in time, but bound together by something eerily similar. One is the Indus Valley Civilization, the forgotten giant of the ancient world, a society so advanced that when archaeologists first uncovered it, they genuinely struggled to believe what they were looking at. The other is the Akkadian Empire, the very first empire in human history, built by a man who may have started life as a gardener and ended up ruling from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean. Both civilizations reached extraordinary heights. Both collapsed, and in both cases, the trail of evidence keeps leading scientists back to the same suspect, the climate itself. Before we get into the collapse, though, we need to understand what was actually lost. Because, honestly, most people have never even heard of the Indus Valley Civilization, and that's a shame, because it deserves to be just as famous as Egypt or Mesopotamia. Let's start there. Picture the year is around 2600 BCE. While the Egyptians are dragging limestone blocks to build the pyramids at Giza, and while Sumerian city-states in Mesopotamia are squabbling over irrigation canals, something quietly remarkable is happening along the Indus River and its tributaries, in what is today Pakistan and northwest India. Cities are rising. Not villages, not scattered settlements, but genuine cities, with planning so deliberate it almost looks modern. The two largest of these cities, Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, sit hundreds of kilometers apart, yet they share the same grid layout, the same brick sizes, the same drainage systems. That's not a coincidence. That's standardization. That's the kind of thing you only see when there's some form of shared authority, shared knowledge, or, at the very least, shared culture spanning enormous distances. Now here's where it gets interesting, and here's where I want you to really stop and imagine this for a second. Mohenjo-Daro had covered drains running beneath nearly every street. Individual homes had private bathrooms connected to this citywide sewage system, something most European cities wouldn't achieve until thousands of years later, frankly, well into the modern era. There were public wells. There was a massive structure archaeologists call the Great Bath, a watertight pool built with bricks set in gypsum mortar, possibly used for ritual purification. The city had granaries for storing surplus grain, suggesting an organized system of agriculture and food distribution. And get this, archaeologists have found almost no weapons, no grand palaces glorifying a single ruler, no obvious temples dedicated to a single state religion. Compare that to Egypt, where you have pharaohs literally building mountains of stone to enshrine themselves for eternity, or Mesopotamia, where city-states were constantly at war with each other. The Indus Valley feels different, almost egalitarian, almost, dare I say, peaceful. But let's pump the brakes here for a second, because I want to be honest with you, the way any good documentary should be. We don't actually know much about how Indus Valley society was governed. We don't know if they had kings, councils, or some other system entirely, because here's the kicker: we still can't read their writing. The Indus script, found on thousands of small stone seals depicting animals like bulls, elephants, and mythical creatures, has never been deciphered. Despite decades of effort by linguists and computer scientists alike, nobody has cracked the code. So a lot of what I'm about to tell you about their society is built from archaeology, not from their own words. Keep that in mind, because it matters a lot when we get to the collapse. At its peak, somewhere between 2600 and 1900 BCE, the Indus Valley Civilization, sometimes called the Harappan Civilization, covered a staggering area. We're talking over 1 million square kilometers, larger than ancient Egypt and Mesopotamia combined, stretching from what is now northeastern Afghanistan through most of Pakistan and into northwestern India. Population estimates suggest at least 5 million people, possibly far more, lived under this cultural umbrella. There were over 1,000 identified settlements, ranging from massive urban centers like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, to smaller agricultural towns, to a port city called Lothal that had what may be the world's earliest known dock, connecting the civilization to maritime trade routes reaching all the way to Mesopotamia. And trade, friends, this is a civilization built on trade. Indus seals have been found in Mesopotamian cities like Ur. Mesopotamian texts even mention a place called Meluhha, which many historians believe refers to the Indus Valley region, describing it as a land of carnelian, ivory, and exotic goods arriving by sea. Picture merchants loading boats with cotton textiles. The Indus people may have been among the first in the world to cultivate and weave cotton, along with beads, pottery, and crafted ornaments, sailing west toward the Persian Gulf to trade with Sumerian cities thousands of kilometers away. This wasn't an isolated culture stumbling along in the dark. This was a connected, sophisticated, outward-facing civilization actively participating in the ancient world's earliest global economy. So now you're probably asking the question I asked at the start. How does something like this just disappear? How does a civilization with engineering this advanced, trade networks this vast, simply fade into the dust, so thoroughly that for thousands of years afterward, almost nobody remembered it existed at all? Well, that's exactly where our story takes its first real turn. And I promise you, the deeper we go, the stranger it gets. Here's the thing that surprised archaeologists the most when they first started excavating these sites in the 1920s. They were expecting, like with most ancient civilizations, to find the unmistakable fingerprints of a violent end. Burned buildings, mass graves from battle, evidence of armies storming through. That's the playbook for most great civilizational collapses we know about, right? But that's not what they found in the Indus Valley. Instead, what they found was something far more eerie, a slow, gradual unraveling. Around 1900 BCE, give or take a century depending on which site you're looking at, the great cities of the Indus Valley begin to change, and not in a good way. The streets, once meticulously planned in straight grids, start to be built over haphazardly. The famous drainage systems, the ones that made Mohenjo-Daro such an engineering marvel, fall into disrepair and are no longer maintained. Public buildings that once served the whole community get subdivided into smaller, cruder structures. Quality control on pottery and craftsmanship visibly declines. And most tellingly of all, the use of those mysterious Indus seals, the ones tied to long-distance trade and possibly to administration, drops off dramatically. Trade with Mesopotamia, which had been steady for centuries, essentially stops. Being mentioned in Mesopotamian records after around 1900 BCE. Now, my friends, I want you to really sit with that timeline for a second, because here's the disturbing part. This isn't a story about a city being destroyed. This is a story about a city being abandoned, slowly, deliberately, by its own people. Imagine watching your neighbors pack up and leave, one family at a time, until eventually you're standing in what used to be a bustling metropolis of tens of thousands of people, and it's just empty. That is genuinely what the archaeological record suggests happened here. But before we get to why this happened, and trust me, the why is the part that's going to genuinely shock you, let's talk for a second about an old theory that dominated this story for decades, because it's a perfect example of how easy it is to build a convincing narrative on shaky evidence. In the 1940s, the British archaeologist Sir Mortimer Wheeler, who led major excavations at Mohenjo-Daro, proposed what became known as the Aryan invasion theory. The idea was simple, almost cinematic. A group of Indo-European-speaking peoples, the so-called Aryans, swept down from Central Asia, invaded the Indus Valley, and violently conquered the Harappan cities, which would explain both the collapse of the civilization and the later arrival of Indo-European languages like Sanskrit in the region. Wheeler even pointed to a group of skeletons found scattered in the streets of Mohenjo-Daro as evidence of a final massacre. For decades, this was the accepted story. It made for a dramatic, easy-to-understand narrative. Invaders come, civilization falls, simple as that. But here's where I need you to pause and really think with me for a moment, because if you were a historian looking at this evidence today, would you still believe it? Because modern researchers absolutely do not. When archaeologists went back and re-examined those famous massacre skeletons, they found something striking. The skeletons were from different time periods, some even post-dating the city's abandonment by years. There's no evidence of weapons strong enough to suggest organized warfare. There's no layer of destruction, no burned palace, no sign of a final battle anywhere across the hundreds of identified Indus sites. The Aryan invasion theory, it turns out, was less archaeology and more wishful narrative, shaped partly by colonial-era assumptions about how civilizations rise and fall. Today, it's almost universally rejected by serious scholars. So if it wasn't invaders, then what on earth caused thousands of years of advanced urban civilization to just stop? This is where the story takes its real twist, and it's the part I find genuinely chilling. Because the answer wasn't found in a battlefield. It was found in dried-up riverbeds, ancient pollen samples, and the chemical signatures hidden inside stalagmites in faraway caves. Let's talk about the rivers, because the rivers are everything here. The Indus Valley Civilization didn't just rely on the Indus River itself. There was another river system, one that ancient Vedic texts later called the Saraswati, which many archaeologists now associate with a once mighty river that flowed through what is today the Ghaggar-Hakra riverbed in northwestern India and eastern Pakistan. Satellite imagery from the 1970s onward revealed something remarkable. The dry, dusty Ghaggar-Hakra channel, largely seasonal and unimpressive today, was once a massive, perennial river system, with some of the largest concentrations of Indus settlements built directly along its banks. Sites like Kalibangan, and possibly even Mohenjo-Daro's broader regional network, depended heavily on the water. And fertile floodplains this river provided. And then, starting somewhere around 2000 to 1900 BCE, give or take depending on the specific region, this river system began drying up. Not overnight, but over generations. Climate scientists studying ancient monsoon patterns through cave formations, ocean sediment cores, and ancient lake beds across South Asia have found consistent evidence that the monsoon, the seasonal rains that the entire Indian subcontinent depends on for agriculture even today, weakened significantly during this period. Less monsoon rain meant less water feeding the rivers. Less water meant the mighty Saraswati-adjacent river system, already vulnerable due to tectonic shifts that may have diverted some of its tributaries toward the Ganges basin instead, began to wither. Now here's a question worth sitting with for a second. What would you do if the river your entire city depended on for drinking water, irrigation, and trade started disappearing? Not in one dramatic flood or drought, but slowly, over 50, 100, 150 years. You probably wouldn't panic right away. You'd adapt. You'd dig deeper wells. You'd shift your crops. Maybe you'd send some of the younger generation to scout for better land elsewhere. And that, friends, appears to be precisely what happened. This wasn't a sudden apocalypse. It was death by 1,000 cuts, stretched across generations who likely had no idea they were living through the slow ending of their world. But there's more to the story than just the rivers drying up. And this is genuinely one of the most fascinating parts of the science behind this collapse. Researchers studying agricultural remains, things like seeds and grain residues found across the abandoned cities, notice something curious. In the earlier, flourishing period of the Indus Valley Civilization, the dominant crops were things like wheat and barley, both of which require reliable monsoon rains and predictable river flooding to thrive. But in the later period, as the cities were declining, archaeobotanists found a dramatic increase in drought-resistant crops, things like millet, a grain that needs far less water and can survive in much harsher, drier conditions. Think about what that tells us. The Indus people weren't sitting passively, waiting to die out. They were adapting. They switched their agriculture to crops that could survive the changing climate. They're showing us, through the literal seeds left behind in the dirt, that they understood something was wrong with their water supply and were actively trying to cope with it. There's something almost tragic and admirable about that, isn't there? An entire civilization quietly, methodically trying to outlast a crisis they probably didn't fully understand, using nothing but trial, error, and generations of accumulated agricultural knowledge. But adaptation, as resourceful as it was, could only buy so much time. And here's where the mini-collapse really begins to cascade, because civilizations, just like ecosystems, are built on interconnected systems. And when one piece breaks, the rest tend to follow. As the river-based agriculture that had supported dense urban populations became less reliable, the massive cities like Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, which depended on a constant, organized surplus of grain to feed tens of thousands of non-farming residents, craftsmen, traders, administrators, started losing their economic foundation. Without a reliable food surplus, you can't sustain a city. You can't maintain specialized labor. You can't keep funding large public works like those famous drainage systems and granaries. Slowly, the very things that made these cities remarkable started crumbling, not from outside attack, but from the simple, brutal math of, there isn't enough food and water here to support this many people anymore. And here's a detail that I think really brings this story to life. Around this same period, archaeologists notice a significant shift in settlement patterns. The massive urban centers in the western Indus region begin shrinking and losing population, while smaller, more rural settlements start appearing further east, closer to the Ganges-Yamuna river system, which wasn't as affected by the weakening monsoon and the drying of the Gagar-Hakra. People, in other words, voted with their feet. They didn't fight to save their dying cities. They simply moved. They migrated toward water, toward viable farmland, abandoning the grand urban experiment of their ancestors in favor of smaller, more sustainable village life. If you really think about what that means, It's actually a pretty profound human story, isn't it? Generations of people who had grown up in some of the most sophisticated cities in the ancient world, with sewage systems, public baths, organized trade, eventually made the difficult choice to walk away from all of it, dispersing into smaller agricultural communities in order to survive. The civilization didn't end in fire. It ended in a long, quiet exodus. Now, I do want to pause here and be very clear with you, because intellectual honesty matters in a story like this. While the climate-driven collapse theory is by far the most widely supported explanation among archaeologists and climate scientists today, it's not the only factor researchers discuss, and there's still genuine debate about the details. Some scholars argue that tectonic activity, shifts in the Earth's crust that may have altered river courses, played a more significant role than rainfall alone in killing off the Gagger-Hakra system. Others point out that collapse might be the wrong word entirely, since many smaller Indus settlements continued for centuries afterward in a less urbanized form, suggesting this was more of a transformation than a total extinction. So when I tell you this story, I want you to hold it the way a good historian would, as the most evidence-supported explanation we currently have, not as an absolute, unquestionable fact carved in stone. Still, even with that academic caution in mind, the broader picture remains remarkably consistent and remarkably haunting. A civilization that built some of the most advanced urban infrastructure of the ancient world, that traded across 1,000 kilometers of ocean, that may have housed 5 million people or more, was ultimately undone not by an enemy army, not by a tyrant king, not by religious collapse, but by a multi-generational shift in rainfall patterns that slowly strangled the rivers it depended on. And here's the part that should genuinely give you chills if you think about it for more than a few seconds. The people of the Indus Valley had no concept of climate change the way we understand it today. They had no satellites measuring monsoon patterns, no scientific models predicting drought decades in advance. All they had was the slow, lived experience of their wells running drier, their rivers shrinking, their harvests becoming less reliable, year after year, generation after generation, until eventually the only rational choice left was to walk away from cities their ancestors had spent centuries building. So let me ask you something, my friends, because I think this is worth genuinely sitting with for a moment. If you were living in Mohenjo-Daro, watching your city's famous drains slowly clog with debris nobody had the resources to clear anymore, watching the river that fed your fields shrink a little more each decade, would you have recognized what was happening? Or would it have felt the way slow change always does, simply like normal life, until one day it just wasn't sustainable anymore? This is precisely why historians and climate scientists alike keep coming back to the Indus Valley Civilization when discussing modern climate change. Not because the situations are identical, obviously. Our technology and global interconnectedness today are nothing like 2000 BCE, but because the underlying lesson is hauntingly similar. Even the most sophisticated, advanced human societies are, in the end, deeply dependent on stable environmental conditions. Take away reliable water, and even the most brilliant engineering, the most extensive trade networks, the most organized urban planning in the ancient world, simply isn't enough to save you. But here's the thing, friends, and this is where our story really widens out. The Indus Valley wasn't alone in this. Around roughly the same broader climatic window, a separate civilization, thousands of kilometers to the west, was experiencing something eerily, almost suspiciously similar. And this one, unlike the quiet, peaceful-seeming Indus Valley, was an empire built on conquest, ambition, and one man's extraordinary, almost mythical rise from obscurity to absolute power. So let's leave the dried riverbeds of the Indus behind for a moment and travel west, across what is now Iran, into the heart of ancient Mesopotamia, to a city whose exact location archaeologists still haven't definitively found, even though we know it once commanded an empire stretching from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. This is the story of Akkad. And trust me, friends, it gets even stranger from here. Picture this, around the year 2334 BCE, in a small, fairly unremarkable Sumerian city called Kish. There's a man working there, possibly as a cupbearer or some kind of court official, serving the king of Kish. His name, at least the name history remembers him by, is Sargon. And according to later Akkadian legend, his origin story sounds almost too dramatic to be true. The legend claims his mother set him adrift on the Euphrates River in a basket of reeds sealed with bitumen, much like the much later biblical story of Moses, where he was found and raised by a gardener. Now, friends, I want to be upfront with you here, because separating myth from fact in a story this old is genuinely tricky. Historians widely view this birth legend as exactly that, a legend likely composed generations. After Sargon's actual life to mythologize his unlikely rise to power, we don't actually know much verified detail about his early life at all. What we do know, with much greater confidence, is what happened next, and it changed the ancient world forever. Sargon didn't stay a cupbearer for long. Through a combination of military skill, political cunning, and what must have been an absolutely magnetic personality, he rose to overthrow the king of Kish, and then set his sights far beyond that one small city. He began conquering one Sumerian city-state after another, Uruk, Lagash, Umma, cities that had spent centuries fighting each other in fragmented, localized wars, never unified under a single ruler. Sargon changed that. For the first time in recorded human history, one man brought all of these independent city-states under a single centralized rule. He founded a new capital city, Akkad, whose precise location remains one of archaeology's great unsolved mysteries to this day. We genuinely don't know exactly where it was, somewhere along the Euphrates, but it's never been definitively excavated. And from this city, Sargon built what historians widely consider the world's very first empire. Now stop and think about what that actually means for a second, because it's easy to read past a sentence like the world's first empire without letting it sink in. Before Sargon, the political world, as far as we know, was a patchwork. Independent cities, independent kings, independent gods, constantly negotiating, warring, and shifting alliances with each other, but never unified under one centralized administrative system spanning hundreds of kilometers. Sargon changed the very concept of what political power could look like. His empire, at its height under his grandson Naram-Sin, stretched from the Persian Gulf in the south, through all of Mesopotamia, up into parts of modern-day Syria and Turkey. And some inscriptions even boast of campaigns reaching toward the Mediterranean coast, and into parts of western Iran. We're talking about an empire covering, by some estimates, well over 800,000 square kilometers, an almost unimaginable scale for the year 2300 BCE. And here's where the story gets even more fascinating, because Sargon didn't just conquer. He engineered an entirely new system to actually hold all of this together, which, frankly, was the much harder problem. Conquering a city is one thing. Administering an empire spanning dozens of formerly independent, fiercely proud city-states, each with its own gods, its own local elites, its own traditions, is something else entirely. Sargon appointed loyal Akkadian governors to oversee conquered Sumerian cities. He standardized the Akkadian language, a Semitic language quite different from Sumerian, as the administrative tongue of empire, even while Sumerian remained the language of religion and scholarship for centuries afterward, creating a fascinating bilingual cultural fusion that defined Mesopotamian civilization for the rest of its history. He maintained what ancient texts describe as a standing army, soldiers who, according to one famous Akkadian inscription, ate daily at his table, meaning Sargon supported a permanent professional military rather than relying purely on temporary levies of farmer soldiers, a genuinely revolutionary concept for the time. Trade flourished under Akkadian unification in ways that simply hadn't been possible when Mesopotamia was fragmented into competing city-states, constantly disrupting each other's trade routes through warfare. Akkadian inscriptions boast, with what is almost certainly some royal exaggeration, that ships from Meluhha, remember that name, friends, the very same Meluhha most historians associate with the Indus Valley Civilization, we just spent the last several minutes exploring, along with ships from Magan, likely modern Oman, and Dilmun, likely modern Bahrain, docked at the Key of Akkad itself. Picture that for a second. An Akkadian merchant, standing on the docks of a city we still haven't even located archaeologically, watching ships unload goods that had traveled across the Indus Ocean. And the Persian Gulf, from a civilization built around rivers thousands of kilometers to the east, the very same Indus Valley Civilization, whose mysterious collapse we just discussed. These two great Bronze Age civilizations weren't just contemporaries experiencing eerily parallel collapses. They were, for a time, actual trading partners, connected by sea routes across the ancient world's first true international economy. But my friends, empires built this fast, on the strength of one extraordinary leader's ambition, rarely stay stable for long. And the Akkadian Empire is a textbook example of exactly why. Sargon ruled for an impressively long time by ancient standards, somewhere around 56 years according to later king lists, though as always with numbers this old, take that with a grain of salt. But almost immediately after his death, cracks began to show. Sargon's sons, Rimush and then Manishtushu, both faced major rebellions from the very Sumerian cities their father had conquered. These weren't peaceful transitions of power. Later inscriptions describe brutal suppressions of revolt, walls torn down, cities punished, populations subjugated all over again, suggesting that beneath the surface of imperial unity, deep resentment toward Akkadian rule simmered constantly among the conquered Sumerian population. It was Sargon's grandson, Naram-Sin, who took the empire to its absolute zenith, and also, in a way that almost feels like a Greek tragedy, set the stage for its eventual fall. Naram-Sin was, by any measure, an extraordinarily successful military leader, expanding Akkadian territory further than ever before, crushing rebellions, and launching campaigns that pushed Akkadian influence into the Zagros Mountains and beyond. But here's the detail that should genuinely give you pause, the kind of detail historians love, because it tells you so much about a person's psychology in just a few words. Naram-Sin was the first Mesopotamian king in recorded history to declare himself a god. Not just a king chosen by the gods, not just a king favored by the gods, an actual living deity, placing the divine symbol, the horned crown, directly on his own head in royal inscriptions, and on the famous victory stele of Naram-Sin, which you can still see in the Louvre today, depicting him standing taller than his own soldiers, larger even than mountains, trampling his enemies beneath his feet. Now, if you were a citizen of the ancient world watching your king do this, what would you think? Would you see it as a sign of supreme confidence, justified by his genuine military successes? Or would you start to wonder if your ruler was losing touch with reality, drunk on a level of power no human being in Mesopotamian history had ever held before? Because later Mesopotamian tradition, writing centuries afterward, framed Naram-Sin's self-deification as an act of hubris, almost literally. the kind of pride that invites divine punishment. And whether or not you believe in ancient curses, my friends, what happened to the Akkadian Empire in the generations after Naram-Sin's death is genuinely one of the more dramatic collapses in the ancient historical record. There's actually a remarkable piece of ancient literature that survives from this period, a text scholars call the Curse of Akkad, written some time after the empire's fall, that tells the story almost like a moral fable. According to this text, Naram-Sin, in a fit of either arrogance or desperation, attacked and destroyed the temple of the god Enlil in the sacred city of Nippur, one of the holiest sites in all of Mesopotamian religion. Enraged by this sacrilege, the god Enlil supposedly summoned a barbarian horde from the mountains, a people the text calls the Gutians, described almost like a force of nature rather than an ordinary human army. People who know no inhibitions, with human instinct but canine intelligence, to punish Akkad and bring famine, death, and ruin upon the empire. That had grown too proud. Now, I want to pause here, because this is exactly the kind of moment where I have to be honest with you about the difference between ancient storytelling and modern archaeological evidence. The Curse of Akkad is a beautiful piece of literature, genuinely one of the great surviving texts from ancient Mesopotamia, but it's also propaganda and mythology written generations after the actual events, almost certainly designed to explain the empire's collapse in a morally satisfying way. The gods punished a prideful, sacrilegious king. It's a great story, but is it the real story? For decades, historians took the Gutian invasion explanation more or less at face value, the same way, frankly, that historians once took the Aryan invasion theory for the Indus Valley at face value. Barbarians swept. In, the empire fell. Simple as that. But just like with the Indus Valley, when modern researchers actually went looking for hard physical evidence to back up this dramatic invasion story, what they found instead pointed somewhere else entirely. And this, friends, is where our two stories start to converge in a way that should genuinely give you chills. In the 1990s, an archaeologist named Harvey Weiss was excavating a site called Tel Leilan, located in what is today northeastern Syria, in a region known as the Khabur Plains, which had been an important agricultural breadbasket for the Akkadian Empire. And Weiss noticed something extremely strange in the soil layers. Right around 2200 to 2150 BCE, almost exactly the time period when the Akkadian Empire was supposedly collapsing under the weight of Gutian invasion, the entire site appeared to have been abruptly abandoned. Not gradually, abruptly. And lying directly on top of the final occupation layer was something archaeologists call an abandonment layer. A thick deposit of wind-blown dust and sand, the kind of sediment you only get when a region becomes so arid, so quickly that there simply aren't enough plants left to hold the soil down anymore, and the wind just starts carrying it away in massive quantities. Let that sink in for a moment, my friends. This wasn't evidence of an invading army burning the city to the ground. This was evidence of the land itself drying up so severely, so suddenly, that an entire agricultural region became essentially uninhabitable, and everyone simply left, all at once. Weiss and his team, alongside climate scientists studying separate, independent sources of evidence, soil cores from the Gulf of Oman showing a massive spike in wind-blown dust, deposits dated to precisely this period, cave formations called speleothems in Iran, and Oman showing chemical signatures consistent with a dramatic, abrupt shift toward drier conditions, even ice cores from as far away as Kilimanjaro showing matching climatic disruption, all began converging on the same staggering conclusion. Somewhere around 2200 BCE, the entire region experienced what climate scientists now call an abrupt megadrought. A sudden, severe, decades-long collapse in rainfall that struck not just Mesopotamia, but appears to have affected a much broader swath of the ancient world, stretching from the eastern Mediterranean through the Middle East, and potentially, though this connection remains more speculative and debated among researchers, into South Asia as well. Around roughly the same broader climatic window that was already straining the Indus Valley's river systems. Scientists have given this event a name, the 4.2 kiloyear event, referring to the fact that it happened approximately 4,200 years before the present day. And here's a detail that I think genuinely deserves a moment of pause, because it's the kind of thing that connects ancient history directly to cutting-edge modern science. This climate event was significant enough and left a clear enough geological fingerprint, preserved in stalagmites in a cave in India called Mamla Cave, that in 2018, the International Commission on Stratigraphy, the scientific body that officially defines geological time periods, used it to formally mark the beginning of a brand new geological age, called the Megalian Age, the current age we are technically still living in today. Think about that for a second. The drought that may have helped bring down the world's first empire was so severe, so globally significant, that it's now used as the literal scientific marker dividing one chapter of Earth's geological history from the next. So now we have to ask the same hard question we asked about the Indus Valley. If it wasn't really the Gutians who destroyed Akkad, what actually happened? And here, my friends, is where I think the real story becomes far more interesting, and honestly far more believable than the dramatic curse narrative the ancient Akkadians themselves told. Imagine being a farmer in the Khyber Plains, one of the breadbasket regions that fed Akkadian cities further south. For generations, your family has grown wheat and barley using rain-fed agriculture, relying on predictable seasonal rainfall rather than river irrigation, since this region sits too far from major rivers to easily irrigate. And then, over the span of what researchers estimate may have been as little as a few decades, possibly even faster in places, the rain that has sustained your entire way of life simply stops coming reliably. Your harvests fail, not once, but year after year. Your stored grain reserves run out. Your livestock start dying. What do? If you're a rational person facing slow starvation, you don't sit there and wait to die out of loyalty to your king or your city. You migrate. You move toward whatever water and food sources remain, even if that means abandoning land your family has worked for generations. And this, according to the archaeological and textual evidence, is precisely what appears to have happened on a massive scale. Akkadian administrative texts from this period actually mention refugees and famine. There are records of the imperial government attempting, with apparently limited success, to manage grain shortages and population displacement. Some scholars believe the very Gutians later, blamed in Akkadian mythology for the empire's collapse, may not have been a foreign invading horde at all, but rather displaced, desperate populations, possibly from the same drought-stricken regions, moving into Akkadian territory in search of survival. Exactly the kind of chaotic, large-scale migration crisis you'd expect when an entire region's agricultural base collapses simultaneously. But, and this is important, friends, I do want to be careful here, because unlike with some aspects of the Indus Valley collapse, the climate explanation for Akkad's fall is genuinely still debated among historians, not unanimously agreed upon. Some archaeologists and historians argue that Harvey Weiss and his colleagues overstated the role of climate, pointing out that the Akkadian Empire was already showing serious internal political strain, constant rebellions, succession crises, an overextended administrative system trying to govern an empire larger than anything previously attempted in human history, long before the worst of the drought hit. These scholars argue the empire's collapse was likely a combination of factors. Chronic political instability that had been building for generations, combined with a severe, but not necessarily singularly decisive climate shock that arrived at, frankly, the worst possible moment, when the empire's internal structures were already weakened and poorly equipped to handle a major agricultural crisis. So if you want the most academically honest version of this story, it's probably this. Climate change didn't single-handedly destroy the Akkadian Empire out of nowhere, but it likely delivered a devastating, possibly fatal blow to a political system that was already fragile, already struggling to hold together an empire built faster than its institutions could genuinely sustain. Either way, friends, the outcome was the same. By around 2154 BCE, give or take, depending on which ancient king list and chronology you trust, the last Akkadian king, a ruler named Shutyrul, appears to have controlled little more than the immediate region around the city of Akkad itself. A dramatic, almost humiliating contraction from an empire that had once stretched from the Persian Gulf to the Mediterranean Sea. The grand imperial project that Sargon had built from nothing, the world's very first empire, the empire that had once received trade ships from as far away as the Indus Valley itself, simply dissolved. Mesopotamia fractured back into competing city-states, much like it had been before Sargon's conquests, though it would later be reunified, generations afterward, under a new dynasty based in the city of Ur. And here's a detail I find almost poetic, in a dark sort of way. We still, to this day, do not know exactly where the city of Akkad was located. Despite it being the capital of the world's first empire, despite ancient texts describing its docks, its temples, its grandeur, archaeologists have never definitively identified its ruins. It remains buried somewhere beneath the soil of modern Iraq, lost to history in a way that feels almost symbolic of how thoroughly this once mighty empire eventually faded from the world stage. Now, before we close out this part of the story, I want to bring up one more piece of analysis that I think is genuinely worth sitting with for a moment. Naram-Sin's self-deification, that moment where he placed the horned crown of godhood on his own head, has always struck historians as a fascinating psychological case study. Was it confidence born from genuine, extraordinary military success? Or was it perhaps something closer to overcompensation, a desperate attempt to project absolute, unquestionable authority over an empire that was, in reality, already showing dangerous cracks beneath the surface, rebellions, administrative strain, an empire stretched thinner than its institutions could genuinely support? If you were advising a king in that position, would you tell him to declare himself a literal god to project strength? Or would you warn him that an empire built that quickly, held together more by military force and personal charisma than by deep, stable institutions, might be exactly the kind of structure that shatters under genuine pressure, the moment something as fundamental as the food supply gets disrupted? But the story doesn't quite end there either, my friends, because here's something that I think ties this entire episode together in a way that's almost too perfect. Remember Meluhha, the trading partner of Akkad that most historians believe was the Indus Valley Civilization. Around the exact same broader climatic window, roughly 2200 to 1900 BCE, while the Akkadian Empire was unraveling under drought and political collapse in Mesopotamia, the Indus Valley Civilization, thousands of kilometers to the east, was beginning its own slow decline as the monsoons weakened and the rivers it depended on began to dry. Two of the ancient world's most sophisticated, most interconnected civilizations, partners in trade, separated by an ocean and a gulf, both apparently struck within roughly the same broad historical window by dramatic shifts in the climate systems they depended on. Now, I want to be very careful here, because this is exactly the kind of pattern that's tempting to oversimplify into a neat, dramatic narrative. And I promised you at the start of this that I wouldn't distort the facts just to make a better story. The relationship between the 4.2 kiloyear event in Mesopotamia and the weakening monsoons that affected the Indus Valley is still an active area of scientific research, and not every climate scientist agrees on exactly how connected or how globally synchronized these events truly were. Some researchers argue for a genuinely widespread, possibly even hemispheric climate disruption during this period, potentially linked to shifts in ocean circulation patterns or solar variability. Others urge more caution, pointing out that regional climate systems, the Mesopotamian rainfall patterns and the South Asian monsoon, are driven by different mechanisms and don't always move in lockstep, even if the broader time window shows some intriguing overlap. So this remains, genuinely, an area where the science is still evolving, and I'd encourage you, if this fascinates you the way it fascinates me, to keep an eye on ongoing paleoclimate research. Because honestly, we are still learning new things about this period of history on a fairly regular basis. What we can say with much greater confidence, though, is this: two of the most advanced civilizations of the early Bronze Age, separated by thousands of kilometers, built on entirely different political systems, one an empire forged by conquest and centralized military power, the other a sprawling network of cities that may have functioned with far less centralized political authority. Both ultimately found themselves unable to withstand a sustained, severe disruption to the climate systems their agriculture depended on. Sophisticated engineering didn't save the Indus cities. Military might didn't save the Akkadian Empire. In both cases, when the water stopped coming reliably, the fundamental foundation that every other achievement, every trade network, every monumental building, every claim to divine kingship was built upon simply gave way. Before we get to the closing thoughts, though, I want to take you a little deeper into both of these civilizations, because there are a few details I left out earlier that I think genuinely deserve their own moment in the spotlight. The kind of details that make these stories feel less like dusty academic footnotes and more like the lived experience of real human beings. Let's go back to the Indus Valley for a second, because there's a site I haven't mentioned yet that I think might actually be the single most impressive piece of engineering the Harappans ever produced, and it rarely gets the attention it deserves. It's called Dhalavira, located on what is now an island in the Rann of Kutch, in the western Indian state of Gujarat. Unlike Mohenjo-Daro, which relied heavily on river water and groundwater wells, Dhalavira sits in an extremely arid region with no major perennial river nearby at all. So how did a city of an estimated 15 to 20,000 people survive there for over 1,000 years? The answer is genuinely staggering when you picture it. The inhabitants of Dhalavira built an enormous, interconnected network of stone-cut reservoirs, some of them massive rectangular tanks carved directly into bedrock, designed to capture and store seasonal rainwater and runoff from nearby seasonal streams. Some estimates suggest that as much as 10% or more of the entire walled city area was dedicated purely to water storage and channeling infrastructure. Picture that for a moment. An ancient desert city that essentially functioned as a giant, deliberately engineered rainwater harvesting machine, centuries before anyone in the region had access to anything resembling modern hydrology. Now here's the part that I think connects so beautifully, and so tragically, back to our larger story. Dalavira's elaborate water systems were a brilliant adaptation to an already water-scarce environment. But brilliant engineering can only stretch a fixed amount of rainfall so far. When the monsoon itself began weakening across the broader region, even Dalavira's ingenious reservoirs couldn't manufacture water that simply wasn't falling from the sky anymore. Archaeological layers at Dalavira do show, much like at Mohenjo-Daro and Harappa, a clear decline in the later centuries of occupation. Smaller, less organized construction replacing the grand civic architecture of its peak, before the site was eventually abandoned. It's almost like watching humanity's ingenuity and the limits of that ingenuity playing out in the very same square kilometer of land. And I think it's worth pausing here to really ask ourselves, if even a civilization smart enough to engineer rainwater harvesting systems this sophisticated, 3,000 to 4,000 years before anyone else attempted anything comparable, still eventually succumbed to a changing climate, what does that actually tell us about the limits of human adaptation? Is there a point where no amount of clever engineering can outpace a fast enough environmental shift? It's a question modern climate engineers and policymakers, frankly, are still wrestling with today. There's one more mystery from the Indus Valley I think deserves a mention before we move on, because it's the kind of thing that keeps historians up at night. That undeciphered script I mentioned earlier, the one found on thousands of small stone seals depicting bulls, unicorn-like creatures, and other symbols. Despite over a century of attempts by linguists, code breakers, and even artificial intelligence researchers in recent years applying machine learning pattern recognition to the problem, nobody has managed to crack it. We don't know if it's even a full writing system capable of recording spoken language the way Sumerian cuneiform or Egyptian hieroglyphs could, or if it functioned more like a system of symbolic markers, perhaps for trade, ownership, or religious purposes, without ever representing complete sentences. Think about the strange irony of that for a moment. We can map the rise and fall of this civilization through climate science, through soil samples, through the architecture of their cities, in remarkable detail. But we still cannot read a single sentence these people might have written about their own lives, their own gods, or perhaps most hauntingly of all, their own slow decline. Whatever explanation they themselves may have had for why their rivers were drying up, why their cities were emptying, remains locked away in a script we simply cannot read. Now let's swing back over to Mesopotamia for a moment, because I promised you more on Naram-Sin, and I think the deeper details here are genuinely worth your time. After Naram-Sin's death, his son Shar-Kali-Shari inherited an empire that, on paper, still looked enormous, but was clearly already straining at the seams. Inscriptions from his reign include a particularly telling detail. He reportedly built a fortress with the rather blunt name, Repeller of the Gutians, strongly suggesting that by this point, conflict with Gutian peoples from the Zagros Mountains was already a serious, ongoing problem, well before the empire's final collapse. This actually supports that more nuanced, combined explanation I mentioned earlier, friends. It wasn't purely climate, and it wasn't purely a invasion. It looks much more like a slow, compounding crisis. External pressure from displaced or opportunistic groups along the empire's frontiers. Internal rebellion from never fully pacified Sumerian cities. And then, arriving on top of all of that, a severe, sustained agricultural crisis driven by abrupt climate change, hitting an empire that was already stretched dangerously thin trying to manage all the other problems at once. If you really think about it from a position of power for a moment, imagine being Shar-Kali-Shari, inheriting an empire your grandfather Naram-Sin had declared himself a literal god to rule over, only to find yourself constantly building defensive fortresses against raiders, constantly suppressing rebellions in cities your family had supposedly already conquered generations earlier. And then, on top of all of that, watching harvest after harvest fail as the rains that your farmers depended on simply stopped arriving reliably. At what point does an empire like that simply become ungovernable, no matter how much military force or religious authority you claim to wield? It's a sobering thought, and Mesopotamian history suggests the answer arrived faster than anyone in Akkad's ruling family probably expected. After Shar-Kali-Shari's reign, the Sumerian king list itself, an ancient document later scribes used to record the succession of rulers across Mesopotamian history, actually includes a uniquely candid, almost bewildered line about this period. It essentially asks, in so many words, who was even king, who wasn't king anymore, suggesting that the central Akkadian administration had become so fragmented and chaotic that even the scribes recording royal history afterward struggled to piece together a clear, orderly succession of rulers. That's not the kind of detail you'd expect from an empire still functioning with any real centralized authority. It paints a picture of genuine collapse, fragmentation, competing claimants, regional governors likely acting more or less independently. The entire administrative structure that Sargon had built from nothing a century and a half earlier, simply dissolving into chaos. And yet, here's something I find genuinely remarkable and worth sitting with for a moment, because it speaks to something deeper about human resilience and cultural memory. Even after the Akkadian Empire itself collapsed, the Akkadian language didn't disappear. It survived, evolved, and remained one of the dominant written and spoken languages of Mesopotamia for nearly 2,000 more years, eventually splitting into Babylonian and Assyrian dialects that would go on to dominate the region for centuries afterward, through the rise and fall of further empires, the Babylonians, the Assyrians, all the way up until Akkadian was finally, gradually replaced by Aramaic in the centuries before the Common Era. Sargon's political empire lasted, by most estimates, somewhere between 150 and 200 years. But his linguistic and cultural legacy outlived his empire by more than 10 times that length. There's something almost poetic in that, isn't there? You can topple a throne. You can dissolve an administration. But it turns out language, culture, the way an entire region of the world communicates and tells its stories, can prove far more resilient than any political structure built to enforce it. I also want to circle back, briefly, to that idea of the Gutians, because modern scholarship has actually become considerably more skeptical of the old, simple, barbarian invasion narrative in recent decades. And I think it's worth understanding why. The Gutians, as described in later Mesopotamian texts written by the very civilization that eventually displaced them, are portrayed in almost cartoonishly negative terms, as uncivilized, animal-like, incapable of proper kingship or religious observance. But friends, ask yourself this: how often in history have the people who win, or in this case, the people who eventually reclaim power after a period of chaos, write fair, balanced accounts of the groups they're blaming for that chaos? Later Sumerian and Akkadian texts had every political and cultural incentive to paint the Gutian period as a dark age of foreign barbarism, both to explain why their golden age temporarily ended, and to glorify the eventual restoration of proper Mesopotamian rule under later dynasties, particularly the third dynasty of which positioned itself as the heroic restorer of civilized order after the supposed chaos of Gutian rule. Modern archaeologists examining the actual material culture from this so-called Dark Age period have found less evidence of violent destruction than the dramatic texts would suggest, and more evidence consistent with general regional instability, economic disruption, and yes, quite possibly, climate-driven famine and migration. Exactly the kind of crisis that tends to get remembered generations later as barbarian. Invasion, because it's a far simpler, far more morally satisfying story to tell. Then our entire agricultural system collapsed because of a multi-decade drought nobody understood or could control. Doesn't that pattern feel familiar, friends? We saw the exact same thing with the Indus Valley and the now discredited Aryan invasion theory. A complex, slow-moving environmental catastrophe gets reinterpreted, sometimes generations or even centuries later, into a much simpler, more dramatic story involving outside invaders. It's almost as if there's something deeply human about preferring a villain we can point to, an enemy at the gates, over the much harder, much less satisfying truth that sometimes the real threat is simply the slow, patient pressure of changing rainfall patterns that nobody, no king, no army, no god, could have stopped. There's one more comparison I think is worth drawing out before we wrap up, because it gets at something I find genuinely fascinating about these two civilizations, and it's the kind of detail that doesn't usually make it into a quick summary. The Indus Valley and the Akkadian Empire responded to remarkably similar environmental pressures in almost completely opposite political structures. And I think that contrast tells us something important about resilience. Akkad was, at its core, a tightly centralized empire. One king, one capital, one chain of command stretching out across hundreds of kilometers of conquered territory. That structure gave Sargon and his successors enormous power to mobilize armies, collect tribute, and project authority quickly. But it also meant the entire system was only as strong as its center. When the center weakened, when Naram-Sin's grandiose self-deification gave way to Shar-Kali-Shari's fortress-building desperation, when the agricultural breadbaskets that fed the capital started failing, there was no real backup plan. The whole empire was built around a single point of authority, and when that point came under sustained pressure from multiple directions at once, rebellion, raiding, and drought arriving almost simultaneously, the entire structure didn't bend. It broke fairly quickly in archaeological terms, within a generation or two. The Indus Valley, as far as we can tell from the evidence available, since again, remember, we can't read their writing, appears to have functioned very differently. There's no clear evidence of a single all-powerful king ruling the entire civilization from one capital. Instead, you have this remarkably consistent shared culture, standardized weights, shared city planning principles, similar pottery styles, spread across more than 1,000 kilometers, without the kind of monumental, ego-driven royal architecture you see constantly in Mesopotamia or Egypt. Some archaeologists have proposed that Indus cities may have operated more like a loose network of independent or semi-independent urban centers, bound together by shared culture, religion, and trade relationships rather than centralized political control. And this is where the comparison gets really interesting, friends, because that kind of decentralized structure appears to have made the Indus Valley's decline look completely different from Akkad's. There was no single capital whose fall could topple the entire system. Instead, you get exactly what the evidence shows: a long, drawn-out, staggered decline, different cities fading at different rates over a much longer span of time. Populations gradually redistributing, rather than collapsing all at once. So here's a question worth turning over in your mind, my friends. And honestly, it's a question modern urban planners, governments, and even technology companies still wrestle with constantly. Which kind of system is actually more resilient in the face of a slow-moving environmental crisis? A tightly centralized structure that can mobilize resources and respond decisively, but risks total collapse if that central authority fails, or a decentralized network of smaller, semi-independent units that may individually be weaker, but where the failure of any single part doesn't necessarily bring down the whole system. Neither civilization, in the end, truly survived the underlying environmental pressure intact. But the shape of their declines, sudden and dramatic for Akkad, slow and staggered, for the Indus Valley, does seem to track remarkably closely with how centralized or decentralized each society's political structure actually was. It's the kind of pattern that shows up again and again throughout history. And honestly, in modern discussions of infrastructure resilience and disaster preparedness today. Now let's actually sit with the modern angle for a moment, because I promised you at the start of this that this story would feel relevant. And I don't want to just leave that as a vague gesture toward climate change is bad. Because, friends, that's not really the point I'm trying to make here. The specific, almost surgical lesson from both of these collapses is about dependency, about how much of what we consider permanent, our cities, our institutions, our food systems, is actually quietly resting on environmental assumptions we rarely think about until those assumptions stop holding true. Consider this. Modern global agriculture is overwhelmingly concentrated in a relatively small number of highly productive river basins and rain-fed breadbasket regions, not unlike the Khyber plains that fed Akkad, or the river systems that sustained the Indus cities. The American Midwest, the river valleys of South and Southeast Asia, parts of Ukraine and Russia, regions in China, these handful of agricultural zones feed an enormous share of the global population. Climate scientists today are already documenting measurable shifts in rainfall reliability, more intense droughts in some regions, more unpredictable monsoon patterns in South Asia specifically. The very same monsoon system, by the way, that the Indus Valley Civilization depended on 4,000 years ago, and that, today, still determines whether hundreds of millions of farmers across the Indian subcontinent have a good harvest or a catastrophic one in any given year. The difference, of course, and this is genuinely the hopeful part of this story, friends, is that we are not the farmers of Mohenjo-Daro, watching our wells slowly run dry without any understanding of why, or the agricultural communities of the Khyber Plains, watching the rain simply stop coming with no scientific framework to explain the cause or predict how long it might last. We have climate models. We have satellite monitoring of rainfall patterns, river flows, and groundwater levels in close to real time. We have, at least in principle, the institutional knowledge and technological capacity to plan for water scarcity decades in advance, rather than discovering it generation by painful generation through trial and error and slow demographic migration. Whether we actually use that capacity wisely, whether modern political and economic systems prove more adaptable than Naram-Sin's overextended empire, or more resilient than the loosely connected network of Indus cities, well, that, my friends, is genuinely still an open question. And honestly, it's one being written in real time by all of us, right now. I think that's what makes stories like this worth telling, beyond just satisfying our curiosity about the ancient world. They're not really stories about the past at all, not entirely. They're case studies, written in dried mud bricks and abandoned reservoirs and fractured king lists, about exactly the kind of pressure human societies are under right now, just compressed into a timeline of decades and centuries instead of years and headlines. The Indus Valley took perhaps a century or more to fully empty out. The Akkadian Empire's core administrative collapse may have happened within a generation or two once the drought truly hit. Either way, the people living through it almost certainly didn't experience it as the collapse of a civilization. They experienced it as their own ordinary. Individual lives slowly, quietly getting harder, year after year, until eventually enough of those individual hardships added up to something historians, thousands of years later, would describe with a much bigger, much more dramatic word. So let's bring this all the way back around, friends, to the question I asked you right at the very beginning. What does it actually take to destroy a civilization that had engineering, trade networks, and in Akkad's case, military power, more advanced than almost anything the world had seen before? The answer, it turns out, across two completely separate case studies on opposite sides of the ancient world, is disturbingly simple. Take away reliable water, sustained over enough generations, and almost nothing else matters. Not your drainage systems, not your standing army, not your divine kingship, not your trade routes stretching across oceans. Civilizations, in the end, are built on the assumption that the climate they grew up in will more or less stay the climate they continue to live in. When that assumption breaks, the consequences ripple through absolutely everything else. And here's the question I genuinely want to leave you with tonight, because I think it's worth more than just an academic curiosity about the distant past. We live today in a world far more technologically advanced than Bronze Age Mesopotamia or the Indus Valley, obviously. We have irrigation systems, weather forecasting, global food distribution networks, climate science that can model decades of change in advance. But we are also, right now, living through measurable, accelerating shifts in our own global climate, shifts in rainfall patterns, shifts in drought frequency, shifts that are already displacing millions of people and straining agricultural systems in various regions around the world. The people of Mohenjo-Daro didn't have satellites or climate models. They had only the slow, lived experience of their rivers shrinking generation after generation, until eventually walking away became the only rational choice left. We, on the other hand, have the data. We have the warnings. We have, unlike them, the ability to actually see this coming. So I'll leave you with this, my friends. If two of the most advanced civilizations of the ancient world, separated by an ocean, speaking entirely different languages, worshipping entirely different gods, could both be brought to their knees by changes in the climate they depended on, what does that tell us about how seriously we should be taking the warnings being handed to us today? It's a question worth sitting with, I think, long after this video ends. If this story made you think differently about how fragile even the greatest civilizations really are, I'd genuinely love to hear your thoughts down in the comments. Do you think climate alone can really bring down an empire? Or do you think it always takes a mix of factors working together? Political strain, environmental change, human decision-making, all colliding at once. And which one of these two stories surprised you more? The quiet, peaceful disappearance of the Indus Valley, or the dramatic rise and fall of the world's very first empire under Sargon and Naram-Sin? Let me know down below. If you enjoyed this journey through two of history's most overlooked collapses, do me a favor and hit that like button. It genuinely helps this channel keep telling these kinds of stories. And if you're new here, consider subscribing, because we dig into forgotten history like this all the time, the stories that don't always make it into the textbooks, but honestly, probably should. Thanks so much for watching all the way to the end, friends. I'll see you in the next one.